Hello and welcome back to News from Nowhere, Scotia's weekly news podcast. My name is Coll McCail. Today is Saturday, the 23rd of May, and as ever, to talk about the news shaping Scottish politics, I'm joined by Rory Hamilton. Rory, how are things?
Grand, thanks, Cole. How are you?
Very well, very well. And of course, Samuel Rafanell-Williams. Sam, how are you?
I'm okay. Thanks for asking. I hope you guys are both well as well.
Indeed. So we have a lot to get through this week because John Swinney has revealed the content of his new cabinet, and we will delve into that in a moment. But before we do, a couple of things to tell you about. First of all, we are perilously close to 1,000 YouTube subscribers. So if you wouldn't mind joining us on YouTube, it would be enormously appreciated. I think we are literally at 998 the last time I checked. So if two people listen to this podcast could just slide on over to YouTube and click, it would be appreciated enormously. The second thing to say is that Scotia has a mailing list and a WhatsApp channel, the links to both of which are in the show notes. If you're going to subscribe to either, we would appreciate if you could review the podcast as well, because it does help us to beat that nasty algorithm. And finally, if you have the cash to help Scotia out on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint or a coffee a month, we would appreciate it enormously. It's only with that kind support that we are able to produce this podcast and Nest of Fearties. With all that said, let's dive into this week's content. As I said throughout the week, John Swinney revealed his cabinet following the Scottish election after the SNP were returned for a historic fifth term of office. The appointments John Swinney made to his cabinet are as follows. Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, Jenny Gilruth. Cabinet Secretary for Public Service Reform, Ivan McKee. I'm sure we'll talk about that one in a moment. Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Neil Gray. Cabinet Secretary for Health and Care, Angela Constance. Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Rural Affairs, Gillian Martin. Cabinet Secretary for Education, Culture and Gaelic, Mary McCallan. Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and Housing, Shirley-Ann Somerville. Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Tourism and Transport, Stephen Flynn. There are, of course, various junior ministerial appointments, which I won't go into, but we may raise in the course of our conversation. Some of these appointments are surprises, others are more expected, some new faces and some older faces returning to the cabinet table in Scotland. Rory, what did you make of John Swinney's new cabinet?
Yeah, I don't want to use the phrase shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, but it seems apt in some ways. I think what stands out to me is the appointment of Ivan McKee to the public service reform role. I mean, to make a whole cabinet secretary level position, essentially just to manage and oversee public sector cuts of about 11,000 jobs, I believe, is quite something. I mean, I'm sure it'll come with more in relation to Quango reform. I know that that's a big talking point of reform. They keep talking about cutting quangos and all that sort of stuff. And indeed, I think Scotland's sort of bureaucratic landscape is quite heavily weighs heavily on Scotland's political governance. But framing it in such a sort of austere way, I think is it sends a particular message to the public. I think some of the appointments are rather odd, if you ask me. I don't understand the point of swapping Angela Constance and Neil Gray's positions. Neil Gray came into some controversy around the NHS just prior to the election. Angela Constance, prior to Christmas, was accused of misleading the Parliament. Apart from that, though, she seemed to be doing a fairly competent job in the justice role. And I think, I'm surprised he didn't use it as an opportunity just to get rid of Neil Gray, if I'm honest, for someone who had made use of ministerial cards for going to watch football, etc. Yeah, it seems an odd one to me. What else stands out? Gillian Martin being essentially continuing in her energy brief, but under a new name of Climate Action. I think what's notable is the language. It's changed towards climate action, but also I think it's strange in the context of, I mean, I seem to talk about it every week, this whole energy devolution, energy autonomy, independence policy, which they want to pursue, and yet not actually mentioning energy in any of their ministerial briefs, I think is an odd decision to make. Jenny Gilruth to Deputy First Minister, I think will have been a surprise to many, certainly those among Scotland's journalists. I think most were trying to see the Deputy First Minister position as a sort of jostle between Stephen Flynn and Marian McCallan as to who was going to take over the SNP next. I don't think it was ever going to be as simple as that. I would be intrigued to hear why it was Jenny Gilruth that was appointed to that position. I'm not sure how she'll cope in the finance and local government brief. I'm not sure if that's exactly her speciality. I the thing I think she was in the education role for about 2 years as a former teacher, and I don't think she'd been terrible. I don't think she'd made incredible strides either in terms of I mean, there were several teacher strikes during her tenure. However, I'm a big fan of continuity and not chopping and changing where it's not necessary. So I'm unsure as to why he chose to elevate her to that position. Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps some of the more junior appointments that this some standouts. Jamie Hepburn, who stood down on account of I think Douglas Ross had accused him of assaulting him or something like that.
Seagullgate.
Seagullgate, yeah. He's been reappointed to parliamentary business, which is essentially the chief whip role, and veterans. Hannah Mary Goodlad elevated to the public finance ministerial role, which is quite an important one. It's this one of those sort of pathways through which quite senior SNP politicians have come through in the past. Kate Forbes being one. Latterly First Minister, and I believe it was also in Ivan McKee's portfolio just before the election as well. A number of former MPs have made their way into the junior ministerial roles, including Kirsten Oswald for victims and community safety, Alison Thewlis for community care, and we also see a few sort of returnees to the junior positions, including Ben McPherson taking on innovation, technology, and tertiary education, which I think will be interesting to see how he fares with that. And I think it's good, I would say, in the context of me seeing a number of cuts in my own university just come through this week, that there is a whole sort of role carved out for to deal with those things, and I hope that that's a positive step. And I'll wrap up here on my favorite of the cabinet, as I seemed to sort of stake my ground last time. Tom Arthur coming back as a junior minister for business and fair work, which I think is probably a better portfolio for him than the social care one that he was on before. But that said, notably, I don't think that there's a standout care position. It'll be wrapped into the health brief, but nothing in the junior ministerial portfolios, which I think is concerning. That Siobhan Brown is in the position to oversee the promise, which is young people focused care. But I mean, given how the SNP's fared on actually keeping the promise in the past, I think it's embarrassing. I'm not sure how much this role will actually continue that. That was a long rundown from me on each of the positions. I do think there's a lot to be said about a lot of them. Particularly, I think I would be interested to hear your thoughts on Hannah Mary Goodlad coming straight in from essentially from Equinor to a public finance role. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the line there is that she's been able to leverage private finance in a previous career as an renewable officer at Equinor, and as a result will be well placed to do the public finance brief. We shall see. Notable as well, Rory, that there's no cabinet secretary for the Constitution, and that independence has been left off the agenda.
I believe John Swinney has taken up the independence mantle. I remember Hamza Youssef calling himself the first activist or something like that. But John Swinney, I think, is taking responsibility for independence under this one. I don't know if you call himself an activist though.
Heaven help us all. Sam, what was your take on the cabinet?
Well, I think Rory's rundown was really good and very comprehensive, and I certainly don't know as much about these people as individuals, but the one notable thing from my perspective is obviously Stephen Flynn given quite a major brief on economy and transport. And, given his background in Aberdeen and, very vocal support for the oil industry in Scotland, I wonder how much him being in this position will conflict with that of Gillian Martin as Climate Action Secretary in terms of talking up North Sea oil and gas. We know that John Swinney's and other senior SNP figures have already criticised the UK government's windfall tax on energy companies for bizarre and really quite inexplicable reason. Like, from my perspective, I don't understand it at all. But so it's possible we could expect some muddling in the SNP's messaging on climate in relation to energy, which won't be helped by the fact that they don't have a dedicated kind of energy brief. Presumably, it's going to be folded into Gillian Martin's purview. That's something we all remarked on when this news came out, I think, Rory, that it was kind of, we're slightly baffled that given Swinney ran the SNP campaign quite heavily on a platform of requesting devolved competency over energy, one would reasonably think a part of pursuing this pledge would be, maintaining the office for it. But I think the other thing, obviously, is been mentioned already, but is this new public service reform office. It is new. Am I right? And obviously, this will be one to keep a very close eye on, as we know that there are budgetary problems that were very poorly addressed during the course of the campaign, and that so far, the government's proposal is to cut between 10,000-20,000 jobs. It could be more than 11,000 from what I gather, Rory, to fill this kind of black hole in the finances, which would obviously be an absolute disaster. We might be speaking a bit more about that later on the podcast as well.
I think if I can just come in before you do, Coll. Sorry. If I can just come in there, I'd be interested to hear what each of you think of the roles that John Swinney's given to Stephen Flynn and Ivan McKee here, because they both seem like poison chalices in some ways. Obviously, John Swinney sees Stephen Flynn as some, a talented politician, and also with a particular base within the party. And clearly, Stephen Flynn has leadership ambitions. However, it's often been remarked on how much of a poison chalice the transport brief is in terms of dealing with ferries, the dualling of the A9 being particularly sort of salient issues for a lot of people. And to give such a sort of weighty or challenging portfolio to a leadership potential candidate like Stephen Flynn, is this John Swinney thinking ahead and sort of trying to say, okay, look, I've given you a brief where you have some substantial responsibility, but here's also, it's also a chance to sort of shore up his own position as like, well, if you can't handle this brief, then you'll be a shit first minister. Or a shit leader of the SNP, right? And likewise, I'm intrigued to know, I mean, I could see how you might see the public service reform position that Ivan McKee's taken as a sort of an opportunity to try and do, something a bit innovative and different, but it also seems a little bit poison chalice. Like he's almost created a position to offload all responsibility for public sector cuts onto someone else. And if you look at it from those optics, why on earth would anybody take that role? I think it's interesting. And just a last thing as well would be, John Swinney talking about both energy and independence a lot on the campaign, and yet neither energy nor independence have a title in any single of the briefs, which I think is astonishing.
Yes, I think you're right. I'll make a couple of points here. One tied quite closely to what you just said, Rory, and you're right to point out the presence of Stephen Flynn around the cabinet table, right, as interesting. And I think one of the reasons that is interesting, and maybe one of the reasons it's necessitated, is because for the first time what you have is this mass departure of SNP old hands, right, round that cabinet table. So Fiona Hislop, for example, who held that transport brief, had been in Parliament for a long time and was one of many to depart during the election campaign, right? So there is this necessity to bring through new blood, and in bringing through new blood, the SNP lose experience. How good and useful that experience was is a different question, but I think it is worth remarking on. Ivan McKee is an interesting character and an interesting appointment, right? Because Ivan McKee is somebody who has had similar briefs before. He was Kate Forbes' deputy, and during Kate Forbes' maternity leave, responsible for Scotland's green free ports. We know all of the complications that come with those, so I don't think he's someone that will bark at the prospect of being Minister for Cuts. Let's just drill down into the political composition of the cabinet for a minute, right? Because I think it does signal a broader pivot rightward within the party post-election, particularly around the question of energy, and I think it is important to make that point. So you have Ivan McKee as the Cabinet Secretary for Public Service Reform. That puts cuts front and centre of the government's agenda. It's not hiding away from the prospect of cutting 11,000 public sector jobs like they did in the campaign. It's quite literally having it around the cabinet table, and as I say, part of a post-election pivot that has also seen this week Dave Doogan, Stephen Flynn's replacement at Westminster, come out and attack the UK government as anti-business. He was promising an unashamedly pro-business voice in Parliament. They're his words. And he blasted the Labour leadership's punitive oil and gas tax regime. Punitive, his word again. So you have this... you have the SNP outflanking Labour to the right on this question at Westminster. Quite a difficult thing to do. Dave Doogan's intervention is accompanied by that of Jack Middleton, a new Aberdeen MSP who used to be a special advisor to John Swinney, coming out and saying that business rate reform was the most pressing issue for the government and that it had to happen as soon as possible. So suggesting tax relief for business in Scotland should be the urgent top priority for John Swinney's new cabinet. What follows that is the cabinet announcement, right? And see if you drill into the backgrounds of the people who John Swinney has appointed, you have a cabinet for the oil and gas industry, because you have Hannah Mary Goodlad, who comes straight from Equinor. You have Gillian Martin, who used to do PR for the oil and gas industry. That was her previous employment. And of course, you have Stephen Flynn there, who boasted after winning his seat in Aberdeen that he would be a voice for the industry in Parliament. So that is the context of this sort of post-election pivot towards business. And I do wonder, right, it's been playing on my mind recently, the clip we talked about last week of Willie Hawkey and Tom Hunter saying, please make Scotland a tax haven, because that's when we'll support independence. And I think that this sort of cultural reach of Hawkey and Hunter and how they communicate through this Go Radio business show that they host is growing quite significantly and is beginning to affect our politics. Sometimes very, very badly, and sometimes in a totally nonsensical way. Tom Hunter this week was caught out for saying that 250 people paid 60% of Scotland's income tax. Totally not true, an utter lie. And yet he was broadcasting on Go Radio, and that went unchecked. So I think, this is the context in which we're seeing the SNP pivot right, and it's an interesting political trajectory for us to observe, because it's an unashamed embrace of an agenda which is going to cut a lot of jobs and give the wrong people a lot of tax relief potentially. So something to keep an eye on. We should move on from the cabinet, unless you guys have any further thoughts, to talk about another piece of news this week from the STUC, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who published the Behind the Rich List report, which shows Scotland's 10 richest people now hold more than 9 times the wealth they did in 1999. Obviously, that links quite nicely into what we were just talking about regarding the composition of the SNP's cabinet. Sam, what did you make of the STUC's report?
Well, quite simply, I read stuff like that and I think, well, actually, this is why all of our lives are getting shitter by the day, by the week, by the month, by the year, basically, because the figure 9 times the wealth of the richest 10 since the beginning of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. is obscene, but we're quite accustomed to hearing those obscene figures. And what I would also point out is that it's kind of broadly in line with the gains in the stock market, particularly the S&P 500, since the same period. It's the same, roughly speaking, the kind of same element of growth, which is the amount of money that money has been able to make for itself in that last period. But what I found especially shocking was the wage growth statistic in the same period, which adjusted for inflation, wages have risen 22% since 1999, which is just genuinely like shocking to believe. And I hope that we're not needing to have the all boats rise debate anymore at this stage. But like, this is literally, we're being robbed. The money is going straight. The way I interpret it is that the money is going straight out of the country into the stock market, and it's just sitting there, and it's just getting bloated and bloated and bloated and bloated. Meanwhile, all the rest of us get poorer. That wealth is harder to tax, by the way, because it's in assets. And here we are, where we are now. Our country is absolutely broke, and the 10 richest people in Scotland have more wealth than the whole annual tax take in Scotland. That's another one as well, right? I think because the annual tax take is like £21 billion, and between them they've got. Let me double check. Something in the region of 23 between the 10 of them. I mean, that's just obscene. We're living in Dickensian times or worse.
Yeah, really, really quite crazy stats. I think the wealth of the 10 richest people in Scotland, the report found, had grown more than 6 times faster than workers' average earnings. Workers' wealth had risen by 22% in real terms, compared to 375% for the super rich. Important research revealing the extent of the wealth gap in Scotland, which I think is often sort of underappreciated because the wealth necessarily isn't so visible here. Rory, what did you make of the report?
I mean, I think it's excellent and timely from the STC to release some research like this. Crucial intervention. What stood out for me isn't actually what's in the report. I think it's the report being in the context of other wealth trends in Scotland around the fact that land ownership still sits at the same percentage, I think, that it did effectively at devolution, right? That around 420 individuals still own over 50% of Scotland's privately owned land, which is 83% of Scotland's land in the first place. And to sit that in the same context as this report, which shows how much wealth is owned by Scotland's richest 10 people, I think indicates something about wealth being hoarded at the top by individuals in Scotland, and the fact that none of it is either trickling down to anybody else, or the fact that none of it is being created by it's being sucked away from the rest of us towards this small group at the top. And I think it's ridiculous. I mean, add this into even the broader context, right, of the SNP's previous government policy. I imagine they'll continue with it this parliament, as we just sort of discussed. But foreign direct investment as a means of funding lots of projects results in capital being extracted out of Scotland. It's Scotland's sieve. And the money goes out to people who already have fuck tons of money. Anders Hoff-Poulsen, I think, topped the list for the richest man in Scotland, and he is Scotland's largest landowner as well. The things are inextricably linked. At the same time, as we've talked about before, there's been about 3 rounds of land reform bills coming to the Scottish Parliament, and yet community buyouts of land in the last 10 years have slowed, if anything, rather than accelerated as they'd hoped. I think there's something to be said about all of this, and in the sense that you could say, well, how much is devolution working? And I think the problem is centralization in some regards, but I also think it's a case of tinkering around the edges. Uh, we've talked about council tax reform, land taxes and property taxes as a means of resolving this. But when tax cuts are so high up the agenda, and also I think there's such a distorted view, particularly within Scotland's media, of like who the top 10% are and who Scotland's middle are, that the unwillingness to talk about the taxes that are needed on people who are clearly hoarding wealth and land, which would, the redistribution of which would actually fund public life a lot better, would, balance out wealth inequality a lot better in Scotland. That talk is just nowhere on the table within Scotland's mainstream media class, because wealth and power are inherently related, and the fact that such a small group of people have such a large sway over money and wealth in Scotland, it inevitably also means they are able to set the agenda. As you've just been talking about, Tom Hunter, he's literally signposted in the STUC report as one of the sort of largest advocates for tax cuts, and yet you almost have to think, right, on the flip side, you guys don't need any more tax cuts. You're already minted, and the rest of us are sort of groveling for a measly penny. Why advocate for more? It's not as if they're already trying to tax you more. They're literally doing not even the bare minimum of taxation. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, congratulations to Anders Poulsen, confirmed once again as Scotland's richest man. How fantastic that is. The podcast congratulates him. A couple of other points.
Friend of the pod.
For friend of the pod. I think there are a couple of important points here, around the ability of the Parliament to influence the wealth gap, right? That links to the conversation we've just had. The Stevenson lecture took place at Glasgow University this week, reviewing some of the data that we've had in from the election. And one of the findings that the lecture revealed was that one of Scotland's 129 MSPs was elected to Parliament directly from working class employment. One of 129 MSPs. For a Parliament that claims to be a workers' Parliament, for a Parliament that when Donald Dewar delivered that famous opening address in 1999, he talked about the Speak of the Mearns, the cry of the welder in the great Glasgow shipyard. Neither the Speak of the Mearns or the cry of the welder can be heard in that Parliament today. Their cries have been muffled by paid political staff, it would seem, because 3 in 10 of Scotland's 129 MSPs came from paid political employment, either for MSPs or for party staff. So what we have is not a workers' parliament, but a political class represented across Holyrood's benches. And I think this is important with regards to closing the wealth gap, because the question arises, where does the incentive to close the wealth gap come from if Parliament is composed exclusively of people who consider themselves members of Scotland's political class prior to their election, prior to being put in front of the electorate? And what this is representative of, what this represents rather, is a pretty grim trend about where Scottish democracy is headed, I think. Because if you have a political class which is talking exclusively to itself, drawing new blood exclusively from its own ranks and offices, in a context where the SNP are hegemonic and likely to win elections for years to come, the extent of democratic input is constrained drastically. The ability of the public to input into our democratic processes and the stake assigned to what they say is massively constrained, not just because of the presence of people like Tom Hunter and Willie Haughey and their overarching influence, but rather because of the fact that Parliament isn't talking to them, but rather talking to the milieu which surrounds Holyrood. So what you have is this total separation of a base of the electorate and a high politics, if you like, which barely involves them, or involves one of them in the case of the Scottish Parliament. So a pretty grim trend, which I think does pose questions about the ability of the Parliament to even influence some of the grim statistics revealed in that STUC report, I think. But That's a pretty pessimistic take to finish on, given we're past the half-hour mark. So, Rory, Sam, any optimism? Rory, maybe to you first.
Do you expect me to be the more optimistic of the two of us? I work for Commonweal. Of course, I'm going to be the more pessimistic. Dear me. I don't know. Look, I think. Yeah, I mean, I really wish I could be optimistic. I think it's quite a bleak state. I think we do still have to start turning our attention a little bit towards the local elections in 2027 and how we can sort of directly influence our own local areas. I mean, I live in Glasgow. Glasgow has such a high proportion of Scotland's population centred there. Very, very stark wealth inequality there. I mean, I always think about the 15-year age. That 15-year life expectancy gap between Pollokshiels and Govan, which are literally, a couple of miles apart. I really think, I mean, of course, I'm a big urbanist, so I believe in some level of like locally grounded knowledge guiding our power, and I think in my own research that's something that comes through, and in Glasgow in particular. But I think that in trying to make an optimistic comment, what that says for me is that firstly, we need to work hard to bring some decentralization from Holyrood and give some more power to city governments, local governments in Scotland. Perhaps there's an opportunity in Ivan McKee's role as a public service reform minister, or cabinet secretary, sorry, to influence what that public service reform looks like. And yes, getting rid of some of the more bureaucratic, managerialist parts of Scotland's public realm, quangos which are unnecessarily untransparent, and not getting rid of, but replacing with more democratic structures, more representative bodies of workers and tenants and other people who live in Scotland, but also sort of giving some of that power away to local councils to be able to do things like raise taxes that will fund public services in Glasgow and things and further afield. So if I'm scraping the barrel for a really optimistic view, then that's some sort of local driven approach, I think, and certainly in the next year, I think is the way to go. Sam.
Yeah, it's not something I'm optimistic about necessarily, but I do think that the price cap on essential goods proposal from the SNP is going to be an interesting one to watch, because there's a whole, first of all, because it is a kind of market intervention that I'd like to see a positive precedent for, and this is not untried. It has been done in places like Croatia, but secondly, because it will raise some interesting constitutional questions as well about whether this kind of proposal is actually within the competence of the Scottish government, because I think the First Minister, the recently returned First Minister, has said that they could use public health powers in order to get these kind of price controls through, which are devolved. But the question is also whether whether it can be within the UK's like market access principles, from what I gather, because that's obviously like a UK national issue. And I think that if there's a constitutional conflict there, then it could raise some interesting questions in the public sphere about what powers the Scottish government should have in order to make people's lives concretely easier. I'm not optimistic about how it will go, but I think it might be an interesting debate and process.
We shall see. I think we will leave it there. It has been a pleasure this morning. Rory and Sam, thanks for coming on. Thanks to you for listening. News from Nowhere will be back a week from now to talk about the next round of stories shaping Scottish politics. If in the meantime you have enjoyed Scotia's output, be sure to support us on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint a month. If not, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, one last punt for that in particular, and follow us elsewhere. Please do give us a hand by reviewing the podcast wherever you're listening. It really does help us out. Thanks very much. See you soon.